Welcome to HorrorBabble. The HorrorBabble Spotlight concludes today with Phone Call from the Mausoleum by Jill Hand. Jill lives in New Jersey in the United States and is a former newspaper reporter and editor. Her upcoming Southern Gothic thriller, White Oaks, will be published May 30th, 2019 by Black Rose Writing, so be sure to keep an eye out for it. For further details, see the video description below. In the story, an office assistant is more than a little disturbed by a telephone call from an individual 60 years dead. We hope you enjoy this one. Phone Call from the Mausoleum by Jill Hand. George R. Harmon III was nuts. He was crazy even for the 1950s, which were batshit crazy times indeed, what with the threat of nuclear annihilation looming over everyone's heads. To make things worse, there was the inexplicable popularity of Jell-O, and of Howdy Doody, a dreadful freckle-faced, buck-toothed puppet that resembled something from a heroin nightmare as it chortled at children from out of their black-and-white televisions. George's insanity took several forms. He was convinced the Russians had planted listening devices in his home. He believed President Eisenhower had been kidnapped by space aliens and replaced by a robot double. He was also terrified of being entombed alive. One way to avoid it would to be embalmed, but he refused to consider that option. That was because he didn't want the Undertaker to see him naked, a fear shared by a greater percentage of the population than you might think. George's fear became an obsession. His way of dealing with it, when his doctor gave him the bad news that his liver was about to call it quits, was to have a telephone installed in his family's mausoleum. If he were to wake up inside his coffin, all he'd have to do was push up the lid, climb out, and make his way over to a marble-topped table where sat a Western Electric Model 500 black telephone. Then he'd lift the receiver. He wouldn't even have to dial. A telephone on the wall in the cemetery office would ring automatically, alerting someone there to come and let him out. George died in October of 1956. The day before, Don Larson of the New York Yankees pitched a perfect game against the Brooklyn Dodgers in Game 5 of the World Series. George was a Yankees fan. He would have been pleased if he'd known, but he was too busy dying to care. Decade after decade, the Harmon family kept the phone line to the mausoleum active. Over 60 years passed. The phone on the office wall had never rung in all that time, not that anyone really expected it to. But now, it was ringing. Meredith Welbeck, part-time office assistant at Holy Redeemer Cemetery, stared in disbelief at the insistently ringing telephone. Ring, it went insistently, as if saying, "I know somebody's there. Answer me." Meredith got up from the desk where she was filing receipts and went to answer it. Meredith's boss, Helen Duncan, had pointed out the phone to her on Meredith's first day of working there, and she told her the story behind it. Mr. Harmon stipulated in his will that the phone never be disconnected. "Pick up the receiver and listen," she said. Meredith picked it up. She heard the hum of a dial tone. She pictured the phone on the other end, covered with dust and cobwebs and surrounded by coffins filled with dead bodies. She shuddered. It was creepy. It was even creepier now that it was ringing. The ring sounded old-fashioned, not like the chiming sound her cell phone made, or the burr-burr of the landline on her desk in the cemetery office, but an insistent bring. It sounded like phones did in old-time TV shows. As Meredith picked up the receiver, a muffled male voice on the other end spoke. "Let me out!" Meredith felt her heart lurch. Her mouth suddenly dry, she rasped, "Who is this?" "It's George Harmon. Let me out," the voice croaked. The words were slurred, as if whoever was speaking wasn't used to forming words, or, horrible thought, because his lips and vocal cords had rotted. Could there be anything left of George Harmon after all these years? Wouldn't he be just a skeleton by now? A skeleton that had come to life and was demanding to be let out? "Oh, my God!" Meredith said. She sank to the floor, the receiver clutched in her hand. If Meredith was having a bad day, what with getting a phone call from a man who'd been dead since before Sputnik was launched, then young George Arnold's day had been even worse. That morning he'd had a root canal, his first. It hurt like hell, despite his mother assuring him it wouldn't be much worse than getting a filling. She'd lied. It had been far worse than a filling. The dentist gave him a parting gift of a toothbrush and a container of dental floss. The dentist had also given him a prescription for 6 Vicodin tablets. George's mother drove him to the drugstore to get the prescription filled, then took him back home, where he changed into his work clothes. Over her protests, George insisted on going to work. He didn't feel bad now that he was out of the dental chair and away from the clutches of Dr. Edwin Fox, DDS. If his tooth started to hurt, he'd take a pill. "If you say so," his mother said doubtfully. "I'll drive you to work. I don't want you driving if you're on pain medication." George was 19. Like Meredith, he worked at Holy Redeemer Cemetery. George was a groundskeeper, while Meredith's work kept her inside the office. They'd never met. George's mother dropped him off at the cemetery garage and drove away. George got out the Mighty Mow, the largest rider mower. He loved driving the Mighty Mow. He started mowing the grass. When his tooth gave a twinge, he swallowed one of the pills with some Gatorade. His tooth was still throbbing 15 minutes later, so he popped another pill and steered the Mighty Mow toward the rear of the cemetery, where the Harmon Mausoleum was. George was unfamiliar with the effects of narcotics. He ascribed the happy feeling that washed over him like a soft, pleasant wave as resulting from it being a fine day, and from driving the Mighty Mow, something the head groundskeeper almost never allowed him to do. The head groundskeeper was away on vacation, so George had seized the opportunity to indulge himself. He also supposed that he felt happy because he was alive, whereas the people buried in the cemetery were dead. He was so elated by this state of affairs that he began to sing. "I'm alive and you're not," he sang to the headstone of Louis Epsom Phelps, 1874 to 1943. "You're worm food, motherfucker. I'm alive. I win and you lose." The Mighty Mow's engine was noisy, so nobody would have been able to hear what he was singing, not that there was anyone around to hear it. That part of the cemetery was deserted. The Mighty Mow lurched up the side of the hill that rose over the Harmon Mausoleum. If the head groundskeeper had been there, he would have shouted to George to stop. The ground at the top was unstable. It might not bear the mower's 750-pound weight, not to mention George's 185 pounds. The groundskeepers were supposed to use one of the hand-pushed mowers when attending to the grass on top of the Harmon Mausoleum, but George was feeling too happy to remember the warning. Then disaster struck. One moment George was seated atop the Mighty Mow, high as a kite, singing a song from his childhood about a cartoon character named Benny the Big Blue Hippo, who enjoyed eating pizza and reciting the alphabet, and the next he was falling. You see, the builders of the Harmon Mausoleum had a dirty little secret. While all the visible parts of the structure were solidly constructed of the highest quality Vermont granite, the roof was a thin layer of concrete. The builders had shortchanged the Harmon family when the mausoleum was installed, back in 1918. Nobody was any the wiser, until the old concrete shattered like ice breaking up on a pond under the weight of the Mighty Mow. With a crash, George and the Mighty Mow fell through the roof. "Ah!" George said. Then his head struck the granite floor, and he passed out. Meredith Welbeck was still sitting on the floor holding the telephone receiver when her boss, Helen Duncan, came into the office, accompanied by an old couple named Ted and Evelyn Ulrich. The Ulrichs were in their 80s and had grudgingly come around to accepting the idea that they might die someday. They'd been to visit the crypt, where they were thinking of purchasing 3 spaces, 2 for themselves and 1 for Evelyn's mother. Evelyn's mother had been a terror when she was alive. She was currently interred in a plot in a part of the cemetery called Peaceful Haven. Evelyn had been horrified to find a used condom on her mother's grave. To her way of thinking, that meant Peaceful Haven had become a bad neighborhood. Evelyn felt it was her duty to get her mother out of there and into a better neighborhood, possibly somewhere in the middle tier of the crypt's upscale Garden of Eternal Repose. "It's too expensive," Ted was saying as the trio walked into the office. "We said we were going to pay for Mason's college." Mason was their youngest granddaughter. Evelyn replied that her first duty was to her mother. "I don't care how much it costs. We're moving, Mum," she said. Evelyn caught sight of Meredith sitting on the floor. Noticing her appalled expression and the telephone receiver clutched in her hand, she asked, "Did someone call with bad news?" "Hey," said Ted interestedly. He shuffled over to where Meredith sat, the soles of his deck shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. "Isn't that the phone that's hooked up to the Mausoleum?" The phone was famous locally. The weekly newspaper had done a piece about it. Meredith turned a stricken face to Helen. "He called," she said. "Who did?" Helen asked. "George Harmon. He said to let him out." "Nonsense," Ted said. "It's just some punk kid fooling around. He's probably on a computer somewhere doing hacking." Ted's knowledge of how computers worked was hazy at best. He took the receiver from Meredith's hand and spoke sternly into it. "You frightened a lady, you hooligan. I'm calling the internet police." A voice replied. "Help! Get me out! I'm in a mausoleum." Ted had seen combat in Korea. He considered himself to be pretty tough, but the mushy, croaking voice coming out of the receiver was unsettling. Equally unsettling was Evelyn's reaction. She'd fallen to her knees, her eyes cast up to the ceiling, her hands clasped in prayer. "On the day of judgment, the dead shall rise, and the wicked shall be punished," she crowed. "Judgment day has arrived. Praise God. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for returning to smite the evildoers, such as my daughter-in-law Jean, who is very insolent to me." Ted, who didn't share his wife's religious mania, told her to look out the window. "Do you see any graves opening up and people climbing out? I don't. That means it's not Judgment Day. Calm down, for Christ's sake." "Don't take the Lord's name in vain," Evelyn snapped. "They might not all be rising at the same time. Maybe Mr. Harmon is the first to rise." Ted doubted it. For Pete's sake, he hasn't risen from the dead. It's just kids. They broke into the mausoleum, and they're fooling around in there." Settling his tweed driving cap firmly on his head, he announced, "I'm gonna catch the little bastards in the act." Helen got the keys to the mausoleum out of the file cabinet. "Let's go take a look," she said. The first person to be entombed in the Harmon Mausoleum was Edwin Forrestal Harmon. Edwin was a promising youth who left Princeton University to go off and fight in World War I. He returned from the war without a scratch, only to die in the influenza pandemic. Edwin, unlike his cousin George Harmon III, had been embalmed. Unfortunately, so many people were dying in the pandemic that there was a shortage of embalming fluid. Undertakers feverishly worked overtime preparing bodies for burial. As a result, some were given a rush job. Edwin, who'd been a handsome fellow who resembled the young F. Scott Fitzgerald, had been among those who'd been hastily clapped in their coffins without adequate embalming. As a consequence, when the mighty Mo fell into the mausoleum with a thunderous crash, he no longer looked like the dashing chronicler of jazz-age shenanigans. Instead, he looked like a mummy that had been left out in the rain, then run over by a backhoe. The mighty Mo slammed into the shelf where Edwin's coffin was. His corpse tumbled out and flopped across the floor, where it came to rest face to face with the unconscious George Arnold. George liked horror movies. The more gruesome, the better. He'd enjoyed such classics as Hell Harvest 1, 2, and 3, and Pledge Week Sorority Massacre. You'd think he'd be delighted to wake up staring into the eyes of the late Edwin Harmon. But such was not the case. Not that Edwin had eyes anymore. His once handsome nose was also gone, leaving 2 slits. His lips had popped their stitches and were drawn back in a broad, toothy grin. His olive-green doughboy uniform was in better condition, but not by much. George scrambled to his feet. He'd bitten his tongue when his head hit the floor, and his mouth was filled with blood. "Oh, shit," he moaned, only it came out as, "or she." He knew where he was. He was inside the big mausoleum set into the hillside. It was in ruins. Bits of Edwin's cherrywood coffin and its stained satin lining were scattered on the floor, along with chunks of concrete from the roof. George didn't want to look at the thing sprawled on the floor, its skinny legs wrapped in puttees. The mighty Mo was all bashed up, and the granite floor was cracked. George groaned. He'd sprained his ankle, and a lump was rising on his head. "Ah, shit," he moaned again. He needed to get out, but how? Favoring his ankle, George hopped on one foot and shook the handle of the heavy bronze door. It was locked. The hole in the ceiling offered another avenue of escape, but it was too high for him to reach. He patted his pockets for his cell phone, before remembering he left it at home. His frantic gaze fell on the table, where there was an old-fashioned black telephone covered with a thick fur of dust. He remembered the head groundskeeper telling him about the phone that was put in by a rich guy who was afraid of being entombed alive. Now, if only it worked. "Please, oh, please," he whispered. He hopped over to the table and lifted the receiver. Yes, it was ringing. The ringing stopped, and someone on the other end answered. "Holy Redeemer Cemetery, how may I help you?" "Let me out," he said. Ted Ulrich strode manfully to his black Cadillac Coupe de Ville, followed by Evelyn, Helen Duncan, and Meredith. They got in and headed toward the Mausoleum. The speed limit on the cemetery roadways was 20 miles per hour, but Ted was doing 40 in his haste to lay his hands on the pranksters. He parked the Cadillac in front of the Mausoleum and got out. The sculpted bronze door was shut, and there was no sign of anyone. Then a shadowy form loomed behind the thick glass that backed the door. "What the fuck?" Ted yelped, taking a step backward. The thing waved its arms and pounded on the glass, emitting muffled cries. Its hair was wildly disheveled, and blood dripped down its chin. "It's a zombie," Meredith gasped. It would get Ted first, and then it would force its way into the car where she and Helen and Evelyn sat, gaping in shock at the horrible figure. Ted had taken the keys with him, or she'd have driven away. Oh, why had she been foolish enough to take a job in a cemetery? "That's not a zombie," said Helen. "It's one of the groundskeepers. He must have gotten locked in, goodness knows how." She unlocked the door, and George stumbled out. Helen surveyed the mess inside and shook her head. They'd have to notify the insurance company and call a funeral home to come and do something about the corpse on the floor. They'd need to call the Harmons, too. "Listen," George said hopefully. "I think I might have undergone severe psychological trauma in there, so maybe—" Helen's steely gaze stopped him before he could finish what he was about to say, which was that he thought he should be entitled to a substantial sum of money in compensation. And that was that. The Mausoleum was repaired. George was fired. He enrolled in community college, where he wrote a wildly exaggerated account of his experience for the student newspaper. The headline was, "I was trapped among the dead." It made him something of a campus hero. George Harmon rests peacefully in his coffin inside the Mausoleum. The phone line is still connected, just in case. You have been listening to Phone Call from the Mausoleum by Jill Hand. Thanks again for joining us for the HorrorBabble Spotlight. We hope you've enjoyed the stories, and be sure to seek the writers out online. Details pertaining to all 5 authors featured under the Spotlight this week will be posted on the Community tab over the weekend. If you're unfamiliar with the Community tab, see the video description below for a direct link. And until next time.